Welcome, welcome. We're glad you're here. Thank you for joining, folks. I would ask folks to turn cameras on. This is a cameras on space. We recognize that sometimes there are exceptional reasons when it needs to be off camera, but these workshops are built for the sake of engagement. So we do ask that people turn cameras on. And it would be great as you come into this space if you could use the chat to share where you're zooming in from today. Be nice to know the range of places. So ask that folks do that. Welcome, welcome. Thank you for making it from fellow resident of Cambridge, Mass. And DC. Paula, I didn't realize you were in Brazil right now. Thank you. Hong Kong, thank you, Emma. Appreciate your being up late to join us for this conversation. So terrific. Well, let us get going. I'm sure some others will continue to sign on. Oops, just lost my screen. So I'm Danielle Allen. I'm the director of the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation here at Harvard. And glad to, as part of my lab and a part of the Getting-Plurality Research Network, sponsor this regular public research workshop on questions at the intersection of technology, governing emerging technologies for the sake of human flourishing and conditions of pluralism. So we have a few norms for this space. We do ask folks to be present with cameras on because this is about interactive engagement. Again, as I said before, there are always exceptions and reasons when it needs to have a camera off or briefly have it off, but we really do ask people to try to have cameras on, be fully present. We will start with a short introduction of the paper and then have a response. And then our purpose is really discussion among all of us. So I'm sure you all know these protocols, but we'd ask that you use the raise hand function under the reactions button to put yourself in the queue once we get to discussion. If you have a point of intervention in the conversation that's short and directly on the points being discussed, you can use the chat to put a caret in the chat like that. And we'll let you interrupt the queue to make that shorter, smaller point. This is a space where the goal is hard and frank conversation of a productive kind. We ask everybody to conduct themselves in ways that prove their trustworthiness to the others in this space. So we also do reserve the right, needed, to remove somebody from the Zoom room if it's undermining that norm of respectfulness and trustworthiness. And I believe those are all the opening norms I need to share. I always, Sarah, forget to check and see if there's anything else I'm supposed to remember at the top.
I think that's all.
Okay. So it's really a delight to be able to offer a terrific, or to offer, sorry, to introduce and to welcome a terrific team of authors today. We're going to be discussing the paper Compressed to Zero, the Silent Strings of Proof of Personhood. All three authors are here: Pooja Olhaver, Mikhail Nikulin, and Paula Berman. Pooja is an independent scholar, lawyer, entrepreneur, and just incredibly insightful thinker in the space of tech policy and the law. Mikhail is the founder of the IDENA protocol that is discussed in the paper, and Paula is the COO of Radical Exchange. Pooja is going to offer a brief commentary or description of the paper, and then we will pass over to Judith Donoth from the Berkman Klein Center here at Harvard. Judith writes extensively on issues of arts, culture, and technology, and just really brings, again, an incredibly original and insightful perspective to these conversations. So we're very, very grateful for her time in contributing to this conversation. So we'll go ahead and get going. Invitation to Pooja. I will, again, when we hit the discussion, I will once again urge everybody to turn their cameras on. Pooja, over to you.
Thank you, Danielle. Let me share my screen. Is that visible now?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so This was a fairly technical paper, so I'm just going to give a quick overview of it. And the first thing I want to explain is why my co-authors and I embarked on this study. We all are grappling with these hard questions around democratic governance and economic distribution, and even the authenticity of information in the wake of generative AI. And this has spurred the rise of a bunch of proof of personhood protocols in the blockchain context and experiments. And these protocols aim to verify unique humans, paving the way for global democratic processes, UBI, and even AI governance. And the ambition of these protocols are quite simple. They are to represent each unique human with a corresponding unique digital identity one-to-one, and enable a kind of global one person, one vote, one UBI reward system. Now, Misha, who's with us, as Daniel mentioned, he's the founder of IDENA Protocol, and Paula, who is a co-author of a seminal paper, Who Watches a Watchman, we decided to band together and do some empirical work to look at the results and match it against the ambitions and reality. And for us, IDENA was this interesting case study because not only was Misha willing to open, the hood and do an audit of his protocol, but they were also the first proof of personhood blockchain experiment that actually succeeded in achieving some of these goals and filtering bots, validating humans, and innovating ways to stop account trading, which is a basic problem which plagues many protocols today, like WorldCoin. Another interesting thing about IDENA is also they didn't rely on biometrics to establish uniqueness, but instead simultaneous cognitive tests with participants selecting user-generated stories with social consensus that made sense in one configuration but were meaningless in another. So as a quick recap, what happened? Well, the protocol launched in 2019, and on-chain data began to show some blocks of one-way transfers at the same time to the same wallet, which implied automation, which would require third-party access to a participant's private keys. So either participants had given up their keys to a third party or they never had them. And so the question was, how informed were these participants? Was this cooperation? Was this voluntary? Or was this something more nefarious like puppeteering? And on the one hand, we had operators admitting to running human pools or farms that paid participants to show up and verify their uniqueness in exchange for control over their accounts. But then on the other hand, we had this other perspective of consensual participants coming to operators themselves because participating in this protocol had hassles. You had to run a node, you need to have a stable internet connection, exchanging rewards in a local currency. So in exchange for private keys, operators could coordinate these tasks better than participants on their own and as a service. So the protocol itself had no way of knowing whether these pools were cooperative or whether they were puppeteered by looking at the data alone. So instead, what the community did is they settled on first making these pools transparent with this thing called delegation. And this essentially enabled participants to pool their accounts under one node instead of each account running their own. And the green area here shows the network pre-delegation where pools were hidden. After delegation, the protocol can measure the size of pools, and you can see solo accounts in blue flatlining, while large pools in pink and red grew. And proportionally, solo accounts where you could also see dramatically shrinking, while large pools in red and pink again ballooned, and eating a larger share of rewards pie, squeezing solo accounts from their rewards. Now, under delegation, operators can handle hassles for participants. They could run their node without needing to know their private keys. But oddly, we continue to see the same transaction patterns and see these signs of third-party key control in large pools. And examining the top 31 pools, all pools exhibit this sign of third-party key access. And if you dug a little bit further, which we did, and acknowledged the financial ties between these pools, there were in fact 23 entities, not 31. And so a few years into the experiment, just 23 entities constituting less than 1% of the network's total entities controlled at least 40% of the accounts and the distribution of almost half of the protocol's UBI rewards. So the result was clear. This experiment in one person, one vote, one UBI rewards devolved into hidden groups and subnetworks, each competing for control over a fixed economic pie with a clear trend line towards oligopoly. And the remaining question was, how cooperative or how puppeteered were these 23 entities? Where were they on this spectrum? And specifically, the question was whether this third-party key access was a kind of voluntary custody as a service choice by high information participants who could hold their operators accountable off-chain in these yellow and orange boxes, or were they more unaccountable puppeteering relationships in these red boxes? And so to the title of our paper, we argued that this improbable and deafening silence, specifically the absence of advertising, the absence of disputes, legal disputes, or even customer complaints, this was more indicative of puppeteering than an accountable principal-agent relationship. And there are other facts that were consistent with our conclusion. Notably, the conversation with the top, human pool operators confirmed that they paid participants. The jurisdiction of the largest pools were in weak rule of law places like Russia, Egypt, and Indonesia. And the top 3 networks controlling almost 20% of the accounts had these meteoric rises and falls. So this led us to a couple of takeaways, and hopefully this can start an interesting discussion. The first is that by giving humans these economic incentives globally to differentiate themselves from bots, even as low as $2 to $14 every few weeks, IDENA gave more informed, resourceful humans financial incentives to control and puppeteer less informed humans as if they were bots. And when participants traded their time for a paycheck from these more resourceful humans, they effectively transformed a system that was intended to be one person, one vote into one token, one vote, where plutocrats and puppeteers gained outsized influence. And because IDENA had solved account trading, this next best alternative for vote buying became off-chain buying of participants' time, which takes us to takeaway 3. Account trading in protocols, which we see today in like WorldCoin, that should not be treated as evidence of advanced mechanisms, and to the contrary, illicit trading might signal a very lack of them and be a precursor to puppeteering. This also suggests that a research agenda which focuses exclusively on thwarting on-chain vote buying, for example, with receipt freeness or advancements like proofs of complete knowledge, don't solve and won't solve for off-chain vote buying into meat space and may actually encourage it as a low-cost alternative. So when on-chain vote buying becomes costly, we can expect the resourceful to simply move off-chain. And this takes us to takeaway 5. When it comes to democratic governance, it's also biases or the problem of faction that we care about. Yet when humans are given incentives to differentiate themselves from bots, they also have incentives to align, control, and puppeteer other humans like bots to amplify their own biases. And more than a biological challenge, this is also an informational challenge that will become more acute as humans integrate biologically with digital networks through neural interfaces. And in this rapidly accelerating future, a more foundational challenge than establishing biological uniqueness will also be establishing the informational uniqueness of participants or the extent to which they cluster with the same interests and biases. And this is not a technical problem per se, but more of a social one. The goals of de jure civil resistance, or separating humans from bots, and de facto civil resistance, or humans acting like bots, are really problems that have to be solved simultaneously, and both are vulnerable to the informationally advantaged and the resourceful. And combined, these challenges are broadly part of a larger research agenda, which I have around collusion resistance, broadly adopting a systems thinking approach to thinking about information control incentives and accountability to networked age when we are trying to preserve and build democracy. So I think we are open now to our first set of questions, and thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Pooja. So now it is over to Judith for a response.
All right. Thank you, Pooja, and your co-authors for this quite interesting paper. Mainly, I'm going to be just raising a bunch more questions, and a lot of them really surface around the issue of names and identity. And so what I'd like to do is start that with a little bit of a critique about some of the naming practices here, because I think some of what has happened here is that there's a lot of assumptions implicit in some of the vocabulary used here. So for instance, even the notion of puppeting. One of the questions I did have was, you mentioned that proof of personhood is about one person being attached to this identity, but it's a little hard for me to understand how that protocol is supposed to be about a single person. That you have an account, you have a key that's easy to give to someone else. It seems like there's nothing inherent in the protocol that makes it in any way difficult to not have like 6 or 7 or 8 people using that account. And that seems to be part of the, in retrospect, obvious notion of being able to say, well, if you sign up for this account, you get a certain amount of money. If you sign up for 70 of them, you get 70 times that amount of money. And if you just have some people going in to do this fairly onerous, I'm just curious if people want to raise their hands. How many have signed up for Adina here and run through the flip testing? So a few of you, but not that many. It was challenging. We'll get to the flip test in a minute. But I think one of the things that's important, because in the paper you do talk about the differences with WorldCoin. And for those who aren't familiar, WorldCoin does use a biometric attachment to their accounts. You have your retina scanned. And there's some interesting discussion, particularly again in the footnotes, about the disadvantages of having a biometrically based identity system, and that part of the idea of having these flip tests is to have a proof of personhood that doesn't rely on biometrics. But I think it would be useful to have a bit more discussion about how you then attach it to a single person, because there really doesn't seem to be, to me, anything inherent in this that attaches it to that person, so that without the biometrics, it's open to multiple people, or effectively Amazon Turk-like entities being hired to do this over and over. Whether this is important, and then the next point I'd like to raise for discussion is to look at the protocols as you have them, and in some ways keep an open mind about, well, it might not be good for distributing universal basic income because of these identity issues, but what is it good for? You have a system that does say that these are people who will commit to a certain amount of work. Let's say for now, and I want to also raise the question of how long do we think these flip tests will actually be AI resistant? Is this a permanent state, or is it till maybe sometime at the end of July? So part of it, another question to raise is the notion of CAPTCHA-like online testing to distinguish a person from a bot, is this a sort of the last gasp of that, or is there an infinite set of these that we can keep doing without them becoming so incredibly onerous that that all we'll do for the rest of our lives is like continue to distinguish ourselves from bots? But getting back to that vocabulary issue, I noticed when I did do the sign up that you've changed, that the level changed from calling novice verified to human to level 1, level 2, level 3. Is that correct, Mikhail? Or, okay, so
Yep.
I think, what? I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
there were many questions, so probably we can just
Okay.
start answering
So I
these.
think, okay, so I guess that was one of the questions as I was reading. There were particular words that were used in the paper. So for instance, the levels, novice, verified, human. It did seem like a bit of a stretch to say, I have passed 3 flip tests, I am now human. That by keeping something that's a little bit more measured, like level 1, level 2, level 3, helps you not make assumptions about what you have proved given that test. You've proved that you could pass level 3, and then I think as researcher builders of a system, that helps you keep sort of an open mind about exactly what has been proved by this. A couple of other things, the small groups being called families, that makes that it has an implied assumption that there's like levels of trust and ties and all kinds of stuff going on, whereas all you know is that these are smaller pools. So again, I would encourage anyone doing research like this to think about what you actually know as you name different pieces. Large pool, small pool is descriptive of what you know. Large pool, family pool, you're making assumptions that may not be true. And finally, the whole vocabulary around symbols and puppets is also making assumptions about levels of knowledge. Is a lot about, how informed the people are. Someone who has time and just wants to make some quick money may be perfectly well informed and making a perfectly good decision to have chosen that role. So again, I would encourage sort of a less fraught vocabulary. And then, so let's see, with just a couple of other points, and then I think we can open this. So one is a recommendation for some future reading in this space. There's an interesting book by the author James Scott called Seeing Like a State, and he has an extended paper that comes from part of it it's got a great title. Let me just see what it is. It's called The Production of Legal Entities Proper to the State, to States, the Case of the Permanent Family Surname. But what it is a really interesting case study throughout history of what states needed to be able to figure out who were the individuals under their control, like who were their citizens, who were the people they could collect taxes from and conscript into the army. You know, it could be positive things like providing UBI or providing voting rights. But he and his co-authors there discuss what that problem was of going from this world of small groups with super meaningful but very local names to the problem of having a state that doesn't know the people as individuals, but has to be able to enumerate them and know all of them, who they are, and a certain set of relevant information about them, and the different implications that have gone about with different naming things. And in a certain way, this proof of personhood is the sort of modern technological extension of this problem. And so I think looking at that as a background piece would be quite interesting to understand how the particular assumptions in a certain protocol get built into what kind of state or non-state or DAO you have, and what kind of things are actually useful for doing with this. And then sort of the final point I wanted to make was to think about the set of rewards and who they are rewards for, because it seems that setting this up, particularly as a way of distributing UBI and money, immediately opened it to being a very attractive system to be used in the manner that it was. I think you might find very different results if you're thinking about using this, using systems like this as a way to police the boundaries of a discussion group so that you're not overwhelmed by bots and things like that, and where the rewards for participation and the level of known identity within it, what's important about trust, or what's important about knowing that it's only humans that are participating, where it might make sense to say people can have as many pseudonyms as they want because we want to build up individual reputations within participation in the group, as opposed to saying there's no reputation, there's nothing, but we're going to give a reward to a particular sort of key-based identity. So framing the different types of systems and the rewards, and what's a reward for a legitimate participant versus the rewards for a exploitive outsider, are going to vary by those use cases, and that will make a big difference in whether the system you have developed is strong enough. They don't have to always be perfectly strong, but they have to be strong enough for the type of attack or hacks that you would anticipate. So thank you.
Fantastic set of comments. So yeah, Pooja and Mikhail and Paula, you could pick a few things in that to respond to. Don't try to respond to everything, because we really want to open it up for the rest of the group to engage. And I'm sure the themes that Judith put on the table are going to keep coming back, so that you will have a chance to respond. But for now, just pick out a few things to respond to, if you don't mind.
Sure. I'll jump to the high level critique, and I agree with you, Judith. And you point out attention, right? And I sort of tried to articulate this even in the first paragraph, that there are, even the concept of personhood is a very rich philosophical idea. And we're coming in at it with this particular angle and this framing. And again, I think the thing is, maybe it's a question of audience and who we're reacting to. What we're reacting to, and by the way, I'm not a participant in IDENA, and I have no stake in IDENA. I'm just a researcher of it as an experiment. What we're doing is we're reacting to the creation of things that call themselves proof of personhood protocols with these kind of general characteristics that have some kind of blockchain component and some kind of like set of incentives like this. But I agree with you, and as you point out to the tension in the footnotes, we're actually, I'm actually nudging towards a much richer conception of personhood, right? That is beyond this sort of simple verification task, whether it's a cognitive task or whether it's a biometric scan. And, this conversation about what is personhood, personally, I see, individuality as almost, can be expressed as also your participation in many groups, many non-financial groups, right? And so in future work, this was sort of a starting point of let's take a look at kind of like where we are now and this growing, very dominant model. And then, in a subsequent paper, we're going to look at like a different experiment that sort of tried to address these problems, but also the very limitations of that before expanding to, a different paradigm that moves even beyond, right, sort of these simple measures or even definitions of personhood. So I agree with you there. And I'm sorry, the footnotes were a kind of like tension point. It's like all of that sort of anxiety about why are we even talking about personhood in this way? And even the way we frame the economic problem and the information problem, that all just sort of got stuffed in there. I'll let Misha talk about the AI resistance and these other sort of term issues that, with IDENA, which were choices of IDENA protocol.
Yeah, probably I would also need to give some context just to give you understanding like why IDENA was created, because IDENA was never meant to be kind of an identity solution. So actually we at the beginning we tried to consider some existing identity protocols in the space just to integrate them into the IDENA blockchain. And the motivation actually was to provide an alternative to proof of stake system and address the challenges of centralization, associated with a one token, one vote system, which is kind of to address the problems inherent in capital, which is heavy tail parity distributed, and we currently see that proof of stake networks have like this economy of scale in large staking pools, which I think inevitable, and as a result, like solo miners are vanishing and giving way to oligopoly. So in contrast, IDENA protocol aimed to build a decentralized network of nodes separated by individuals, and the goal was to have kind of an excessive number of nodes facilitating, high throughput and solving like a blockchain scalability by having sharding of the network. And in this kind of sharded network, every node was intended to be operated by a unique human with a unique identity. So giving that context, the question was why, how flip tests provide this uniqueness. Actually, the idea is that these flip tests, they run simultaneously for all participants, regularly, once per 2 weeks, or maybe it depends on the network size actually, and that it's based on the idea that you cannot be in multiple places at the same time. So when you're joining this validation ceremony, you're actually proving that you're capable to solve this flip test, and then if you're kind of fast enough, then you probably can solve to validate 2 identities, but you can have tens of or hundreds of identities. So I would call it a semi-uniqueness. So it doesn't attach your kind of account one-to-one, one account, one person, but it might be one person to one to 2 accounts. Yeah, so that was I think my answer. What else was
I think the question was around the AI resistance.
Yeah, AI resistance is also important thing. So it's the idea of AI resistance actually is based on that all this flip test is a user-generated story. So it means that actually the participants they create these flip tests, and we have so-called like friendly AI that actually helps users to create these flip tests, and we plan to improve that AI so that it can challenge that and filter out like weak and like bad flip tests that are not AI resistant. So we rely on this like framework where we have like humans in the loop, so they kind of improving their flip test over time and making it more and more like AI resistant. So that's the idea. And yeah, and another question was how long do we have to make this flip test, right? Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say you don't have to address all questions, Mikhail, right now if you don't mind.
All right.
That feels
Okay.
good. Maybe we could say thank you right there if that's all right. And then
Okay.
awesome. Thank you. That's great. Really
May,
appreciate
may
it.
I share a few just very brief comments, Danielle,
Sure.
in response to Judith?
Yes.
Well, one thing, following on what Pooja was saying, one thing that it's important to have in mind here when looking at this paper is that this is in many ways a response to a worldview that is very dominant in Silicon Valley right now and across entities and people working in frontier AI models, which is that we should accelerate the development of these tools, and whatever economic or labor disruptions that come out as a product of that can be addressed by essentially decentralizing the governance of these systems and then distributing a universal basic income to the world out of the profits that are generated by these frontier models. And so we're not arguing for this particular paradigm. We're pointing out some of the flaws and limitations that exist within that worldview by taking this early experiment with IDENA and showing what happened in practice there. And then another point is that I think what's really interesting about what IDENA has been able to achieve is that they, as Misha was saying, they were not trying to create global democracy. They were trying to understand how to create a functional, decentralized network, which is a very complex, challenging technical problem. And they were able to make some important advances in understanding what are some of the requirements and challenges there. And I think that with this paper, what we're trying to do is we're giving even more nuance to what the challenge is. So essentially, if you want to have a decentralized network, not only you need to be able to fight bots, make sure that artificial intelligence systems are blocked and this only has human nodes, so human participants in the governance and maintenance of this decentralized network, but that you also need to fight collusion resistance, which is this deeper problem. So I think that their contribution is huge, and it's also good to keep in mind that they were not intended to create a global democracy, but really to create a very well decentralized technical network. So I'll stop here and excited to hear more questions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. That was a really rich set of responses. Now, as we turn to discussion, would love to invite people to turn their cameras back on if you've turned them off. Also, congratulations to Daniel and Kalia and Wendy for using chat in exactly the right way. So we don't want to use chat to put our questions or big thoughts in because we want to like really stay attentive to the actual conversation going back and forth, but clarifications like that, little small points of information. Awesome. So thank you for that modeling of like awesome chat behavior. And so the other thing I realized I forgot to say was before you ask your first question or ask your question, can you just please introduce yourself as well? So let us know again where you're zooming in from and what kind of context you work in or brings you to this conversation. So a few more norms. The floor is open. You can go to the reactions button, raise hands, and we can open up the full conversation. I know there's questions out there. I've got my own questions. I'll jump in with my questions in a minute if need be, but I know there's questions in there. So anybody else want to jump in? Alrighty. So your question, Pooja, for you in the first instance, really is about, as I say, sort of some of the core kind of conceptions of democratic governance. I'm particularly interested in this tight coupling between one person, one vote, one reward. And I wonder whether that is itself part of the challenge. In other words, the kind of tight coupling of a political system and an economic system. This conversation comes up in all kinds of ways. You know, if you ask young people what democracy is and you get back an answer, which is actually an answer describing capitalism, and you realize there's a sort of kind of confusion about the relationship between political systems and economic systems. And so I wonder at a theoretical level, whether or not the sort of projects, the experiments and so forth might benefit from actually separating the sort of goals around power allocation and the goals around economic system. Of course, they interact, but I'm just curious sort of what you would think about that kind of decoupling, theoretically speaking.
It's a rich question. I mean, I think the one person, one vote, one reward is a very convenient bootstrapping effect for these networks to get people to join them. And then it's sort of lumped as quote unquote democratic. And my view of democratic decision making is is very different from that. There's subsidiarity in power, right? There's also, what is the point of a democratic system? It's to provision goods that say marketplaces don't do very well, right? And solving externalities. And how do you surface what those externalities are? Well, actually, you want to ping, diverse groups that aren't necessarily talking together and find what's in the common good, right? And those are like good practices for figuring out what's in the public good. And these systems, global systems that kind of compress, right, information to one person, one vote, miss that informational diversity and can overlook it as we're kind of entering this digital age where attention auctions are really clustering human beliefs and desires in very unpredictable, non-geographic, non-localized ways. So I do think they need to be separated as problems, but at the same time, I want to kind of shoot back as well that it's precisely this intersection that is sort of the intersection and the question for the 21st century. Like, what is the intersection of money and voting? And we see these tensions everywhere, right? We see it in like campaign finance law is this perpetual balancing act, right? Of what is the influence that money should have on democratic systems and in what contexts, right? Do we acknowledge corporations as persons or not? Even in the sort of quintessential capitalist context of the boardroom, you have this conflict of money and voting, right? Because you have these systems of, say, for example, board governance or even shareholder voting that are checks on the power of managers to loot, right, from shareholders and the constituency that they're supposed to be benefiting. But there's even ways where that kind of, intersection collides where, for example, people might sell their shareholder vote and separate their economic and their voting interest. And so how, yes, I think money and voting, are sort of different issues, but at the same time, they are at loggerheads. And it's this tension, right, that we have to recognize in democratic governance and figure out what is the influence, right, of money in these systems and how do we balance, say, even like, big questions on like population size, on global problems like climate change. One country has 3 billion, citizens, another country has 300 million. What should be their influence, right? Or the country with 300 million people has way more contributions and say like an economic, say, shared pie than a country with 3 billion. What should that influence be? And so these, I think, fundamentally are the questions that we have. But I don't know if I've addressed your question.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's a lot more to it, but it'll come back around again, I'm sure. So that's great for now, Pooja. Thank you. Let me go over to Omo, and Omo, please remember to introduce yourself before you share your question.
Thank you, Danielle. And thank you, Pooja. My name is Omo, but my friends call me Omo. I work in the civic space in Nigeria. I've engaged political reforms for over a decade. My question is somewhat reductionist in approach because I'm trying to apply it to electoral integrity in Nigeria and Africa generally. Now, in the light of persistent electoral fraud incidents, there's been this growing movement for introducing cryptographic technologies in the electoral system. There have been conversations as well as to how AI could enhance electoral integrity in Nigeria and Africa generally. But there are opponents who point out that these technologies are not fail-proof and that they are vulnerable to hacks of various kinds and might not necessarily prevent such challenges as multiple voting. And opponents also argue that even the most advanced democracies like the United States still largely run manual voting systems, counting systems. So, there's been this strong debate. And so I'm wondering whether the proof of personhood concept can help mediate between these two camps, and whether there are prospects for applying such technologies in really enhancing our voting system, and what the dangers are based on the proof of personhood concept. Thank you.
So you mean the proof of personhood concept, like like blockchain-based proof of personhood specifically, right? That like this IDENA model. I mean, voting for even regardless of proof of personhood is just you have an account that's associated with a person and that person has done some amount of activities to validate their account, right? The point of the paper was to say that doesn't actually show the person controls that account, right? That person can be an employee. So on that mark, I would say, no, I don't think proof of personhood systems are good for, meat-based voting. Even without that, though, even like I'm going to take you a second level, even if you could presume that one person did control their account, under this optimistic assumption, which I don't think you can make, but even assuming that optimistic assumption, and later in the paper we talk about voting security, a section on voting security, and there's been a lot of research out of Ari Jules' network, for example, that on-chain voting, even say a person controls their account, you can be vulnerable to bribes that happen in trusted execution environments, and there's no way to really know, right? And so there's still a lot of work to be done there. So I don't think these systems are more reliable than meat-based systems, and there's certainly a lot of vulnerabilities there right now. Now, how does Nigeria actually solve its problem of in-person voting? I think it can look to experiments in successful democracies, even I think Taiwan. And I see Glenn just joined the conversation here. Maybe he wants to say something about that. Offer, good examples of how to, have robust voting systems while there are intense pressures to undermine voting.
Great. Thanks, Pooja. Wendy, again, please introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. This has been fascinating. I'm Wendy Seltzer, lawyer and technologist with a lot of work in currently in identity and governance for Tucows. So I think, I guess, this raises all sorts of great questions. One that's top of mind for me is, are you leaning toward a sort of demonstration of impossibility of a sort of global unique personhood notion? And does that suggest that we look more at sort of contextual uniqueness, that in smaller groups you can demonstrate your individuality, and as we try to scale up, we should be scaling up with organizations fitting together rather than a canvassing of all of the individuals.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. That's part of it. In terms of impossibility, I think it's more that if there's this kind of view, worldview that you need to have this sort of base layer, human base layer, biological uniqueness, and then everything builds on top of that. And that's how we solve all these problems of economic, redistribution and governance questions. And I think the point is more that you can't sort of take this like reductive view on individual biological uniqueness, that's just sort of one aspect, right, of a person. There's all these other aspects of identity which are actually negotiated with groups, right, and are highly contextual. And people have partial perspectives, not whole perspectives on somebody. And that's a much richer form of identity that can actually be that's not just good for democracy or good for governance, but actually necessary for it, right? And so finding ways to express and preserve kind of the contextual integrity of different aspects or facets, right, of individual identity is really key. And these sort of global experiments that are reductive to one aspect of, a test, are you verified or not verified, are really vulnerable to just, ending in oligopolistic control because of the, necessary information asymmetries and differences that exist across people in time and place.
Great, thanks, Pooja. Allison.
Yes, thank you. I'm Allison Davis Whiteeyes. I am the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Fielding Graduate University. And Pooja, really appreciated your answer that you just shared right now. Gives me a lot to think about and actually is hopeful, which is a good thing. I might take this in a little different direction. I wonder about issues of privacy and security with this. We're talking about capturing individual data, metadata, from a variety of people. And I'm thinking in terms of, I don't know if you've read Edwin Black's IBM and the Holocaust. It's a very controversial book. I understand that. But as a person who is concerned about the most vulnerable in our society, I worry quite a bit, actually, about the amount of personal data that will be somewhere that may possibly be accessed by governments. I mean, at this point, we wouldn't need a Gestapo or a Stasi because we would have all this metadata. So I'm curious how people are making sure that the people are safe and secure. Right now, we have open access to census records, and I have seen in my line of work the amount of doxing and bullying, and it's quite frightening because this is sort of on the precipice of a certain sort of surveillance that I'm very uncomfortable with. So I don't know if any of the speakers wish to answer that. I know, Judith, you kind of touched on some of that a little bit as well, but anyone, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the problem, right? We want to build systems that enable human cooperation without surveillance and without, right? I don't think any identity system should, for example, reveal all information about myself to everybody or even Google or even, right, government, because then that makes me a vulnerable target, right, for manipulation, coercion, and so on. And so how do you actually build systems that preserve, right, privacy are really important. But I think the maybe slight nuance I would add is like privacy is actually a social concept. And so right now we're having a conversation as a group, right? And we have certain privacy norms and expectations around that. And if, one of you were to be recording this conversation and putting it on YouTube at the same time, it would be violating this like privacy norm that we have right now. And so, the key to building these systems is actually encoding what our social expectations are as groups. And if you think about identity as your participation in many groups and your like negotiated participation in many groups, right? You can think of actually part of one way to look at identity is just being a constellation to many different groups with many different sort of privacy norms and respecting those privacy norms as a group. And generally, those privacy norms don't mean blasting out all that information, right, to everybody else. It's only in very limited contexts like Twitter that people do that, but that's not, right, the norm. That should be the exception. I don't know if I answered your question, but.
Can I just make a couple of quick comments about identity here, and privacy, just for clarification? Because I think the strength of this paper, particularly in its contrast with some of the other proof of personhood attempts that are biometrically based, was it is trying, though it doesn't quite succeed, in not using biometrics to do this. So you have, but on the other hand, because it doesn't do a good job of connecting a sort of virtual person to a real person, when you do want that singular identity that is effectively body-based, like if you're going to have one person, one vote, one person, one income, you haven't solved it with this. So that's one notion of identity, is that singularity that we think of as being the embodied identity. What Pooja is talking about in terms of privacy is probably most usefully thought of online in terms of different forms of pseudonymity, where you are collecting a series of behaviors, comments, etc., around a identifying name. They may or may not be attached to a real world person, but they have a persistence to them. There's a different type of identity that's about social identities that have to do with your role in society, but it's those first two that are what I think of as personal identity, that are about who is a particular individual with some kind of persistence over time, which is separate from the privacy issues and other things around that notion of social identity. And it's important to be able to articulate these well, because the different technical solutions or approaches tend to make these much more starkly different than they are in our face-to-face world, where we don't have to think about them in that articulate a way. It just kind of happens a little more easily.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's helpful, Judith. I want to pause for a sec and ask Allison if you can clarify this point of clarification in the chat. Came from Kalia about census
Yes.
records. Yeah.
Yes. So, again, in the line of work I have, I receive a number of issues that come across my desk, and lately there have been issues related to people accessing online heritage sites and so on, and then publishing all of that information on a blog that then is used to dox people. So
So how also this is, they're able to use heritage information from the census that's more than 75 years old, but people are living in one place for long enough, or is there
it
something
could be
that's
anybody. If they have an account with, say, ancestry.com or any of these sorts of things, you can technically access a lot of information and then publish that.
right? No, that I think I understand. I think there was a sort of very specific question about the census and
But
records dealing
that's
with
in
the
the
census.
it's in there. The census information is in there. That's the
It's in
problem.
Ancestry, is in
Yeah,
things
yeah,
like
yeah,
Ancestry.com. I see. So there's some kind of private contract between the Census
Mhm,
Bureau and
mhm,
Ancestry that
mhm,
is
mhm.
producing a kind of
And it's
backdoor
not
access
just
to
them.
the
It's not
census
just that
data.
one group. I mean, there's several that do that because you have people doing genealogical research.
Right.
But the problem is that then it leads to individuals,
Mhm.
gathering data to dox others and so on and so forth. And
Gotcha. Okay.
it creates a lot of problems.
Yep. Yes, and that it does. No question about that. Great. Thank you. I have a question from Konstantinos, who's in a quiet place, and so he can't actually speak orally. So he has DM'd me his question, which I realized I should have also indicated was a possibility if you are in a place where you can't actually vocalize something. So, and it's so I'm going to vocalize it. Actually, it's very helpful because it happens to be one of my questions too. So I'm very selfish and greedy in that regard. And so for starters, Konstantinos makes the point that the sort of what puppeteers and cooperative pools are doing is really just like what political parties do. you know, in, I guess, the meat world. Is that what we also call in real life? Okay. And so I'm going to slightly editorialize. This is not something Constantino said. My part of the question would be, you know, is there a problem with like methodological individualism, like really trying to reduce all decision-making and information to individuals, when in fact, what humans do always is coordinate, because there are always high information and low information people and so forth, and parties are the example of the structure that actually makes that manageable. There are better and worse versions of that structure. And so is it more about trying to figure out the better and worse as opposed to about avoiding them? And so then, so Konstantinos asks, you know, would party action be legitimate in your model or not? And so I think hearing a little bit more on that subject would be helpful. And then he also adds, in all kinds of digital voting, it is in principle impossible to preclude that no one else, a puppet master or party cadre, is physically present next to the human user, or that they are not monitored in one way or another. Therefore, such platforms can at first be used in narrower environments and perhaps with fixed membership, or by using social security numbers, which few would be willing to cede to thirds. So in other words, given the impossibility of avoiding party action and party pressure on individuals, might there be some other solutions? And more generally, how do you think about this theoretical problem?
Yeah, so I agree with you, Daniel. Like so one of the points that we tried to make was this was actually a spectrum, right? Exactly. It is humans coordinate, they form groups, they form parties, they delegate. And the question is that how accountable is that principal agent relationship? And so, and actually this is touching on Judith's point earlier, even this language of puppeteering, what we're trying to do is say, look, acknowledge there's a spectrum of accountability here with principal agent relationships, and actually kind of bridge this conversation with information game theoretic literature, right, on this, that studies this. And so, you know, I think the takeaway from IDENA is if you just sort of let these systems run on their own without, right, robust accountability mechanisms or even thoughtfulness about that, it ends in like oligopolistic market structure, right, or political structure, right? They end up being the same thing. And so the question is, well, how do we actually make these systems more accountable? So we have, you know, agents really representing the interests of their principals, and to the extent that we make them accountable, they're more legitimate, right? And so this actually goes to the point on identity. Judith, I actually think the personal identity and social identity question converge, because the point of the IDENA experiment is somebody can say that they control an account. They can be the person who goes to the voting booth. But if they're fed misinformation, are they really agentic, right? If they're just have all this kind of like false information about the world, or they're just sort of being primed, I don't think we would say they're so agentic. But so what actually makes somebody agentic? What makes, you know, agents accountable and legitimate is when the principals themselves have, you know, relatively diverse sources of accurate information from different groups and aren't just so captured, right, by one party, or say one sort of like entity. I mean, at the extreme is like, you know, autocratic politics, right? And so part of having, you know, legitimate and accountable representation, and also, right, being agentic in politics, is acknowledging that like actually being members of diverse social groups with diverse information makes you more sort of, you know, a better political participant, and not so easily duped as a puppet, if that makes sense.
Can I just push back against that for a second? I think because I mean, I personally agree with you about the importance of diversity, but I think a lot of the basis, certainly here on voting, is that people are puppets to the extent they feel that they or not, whether they feel they are coerced. So, you know, there's certainly many people who will go to church and say, and the pastor will say, this is how I want you to vote. And they will vote that way, but that's what they want to be doing. They don't feel like they're coerced. They feel that that is how they make decisions. I think that it's worth, for the sake of thinking about what's legal voting, to distinguish that between that and somebody who is told, if you want to get a job here, or if you want me not to shoot you, here's how you vote. That's coercion. And that's a very different place than saying, well, people who have a diverse set of ideas are better able to vote. That's a perspective, but someone who feels that their church leadership is the right way to make decisions, we still think they have a right to vote that way.
All right, I wasn't saying that you should draw on like this is a
Right, but I'm
legal.
just making, yeah, I think it's just helpful to make that clear because the coercion part is important. Because for instance, when you get back to the original question about, well, a while ago about voting in Nigeria and about keeping elections secure, there is that real issue. Like one of the things, if you read what keeps elections in America secure, part of it is you go into a voting booth. So even if you've promised someone that you are going to vote a certain way, when you go into that voting booth, they can't physically see you vote. They just have your word of mouth for it. So the actual instantiation of that process is key. Whereas, I mean, what it made me think was that's something I haven't read, is that that's an insecurity with mail-in voting because they can sit and force you to show their ballot. But that's coercion is different than having preferring like who you count as your influence.
Yeah, I guess what I was trying to make the point is like, there's the way I'm thinking about power is on two dimensions, right? There's control, a gun to your head, right? And there's also information. And so you take an example of like an autocrat, like Putin, for example, right? He controls media channels, which control information, which ensure his own electoral outcomes. Is it coercion, right? And so what I'm trying to acknowledge here is that there's an underlying structure, market structure, actually, to information, and that there are these cases where kind of collusion and coercion sort of start to blur. And we have to think about when we're building systems that are, quote unquote, democratic or seeking to surface, consensus across difference and provision public goods, that we're also acknowledging, right, the kind of sources of information. And if sort of even if like the population is split into polarities and they both believe like false things about the world, right, that's not really a great state for democratic voting either. And so just acknowledging that, there is also this underlying information, right, game that's happening, and the extent to which you're a participant in many information channels that are kind of like uncorrelated and not talking to each other, that kind of makes you more likely or like less vulnerable than if you are just part of like the Putin channel, right? And in this case with IDENA, in this thought experiment, or in this like actual experiment, right, what we ended up seeing with this was this kind of oligopolistic structure, which I think we can do better than in democratic voting, right?
So this is a fantastic conversation. We're at a point in time, I would love to ask both Mikhail and Paula what they think about the issue of accountability, principal-agent relationships, but I'm going to have to put a pin in that for now, because we wrap at 1:15, and our last phase of this is ask everybody to use the chat in the end, to put whatever your biggest, most burning question is that is still remaining. And so we do 3 minutes, cameras off. And everybody can put something in the chat. And then when we come back, my colleague Sarah is going to take over the rest of the meeting till the close. Sarah Hubbard and Pooja, Mikhail, Paula, you can all pick one of the questions from the chat to respond to, and then we'll save the chat for you to take away. And that is where our conversation will be today. Okay. So come back at 6 minutes after the hour, if you don't mind, and put something, your biggest burning question in the chat in the next 3 minutes. And thank you, Sarah, for taking over. And thank you, colleagues, for a great paper.
Okay, if everyone wants to get their last questions into the chat, and then we will open it up for a bit of response from the authors. Okay, perfect. Well, I will save all these questions and invite people to come back on their cameras. And then Pooja, Mikhail, Paula, if there's any particular questions from this list you'd like to answer, the floor is yours again to kind of wrap us up.
I'll answer one question, then hand it over to Paula and Misha. There's two questions. One was good identity systems, and another question about surveillance. And one of the things that we didn't talk about, which is really important, is with these, the thing that I find so challenging about these global identity protocols is in order to actually make it work, if you were to try to make it work and stop, whether it be account trading or somebody controlling somebody else's accounts and paying them, right, as a service, what you end up having is global enforcement, right, which requires global surveillance. And of course, that's like scary and problematic. So, to push, and part of the goal, I think, of any identity system that's being built is to push enforcement down to the level at which, information relevant to that identity is being created, and this solves a surveillance problem. So I tend more towards thinking about things in terms of social identity and representing people as memberships to different groups and their solidarities and affiliations. And when you think about identity in that way, this kind of global enforcement / surveillance problem gets pushed down to a community enforcement problem, where the community that confers that credential, so I'm a member of a bar association, they're in a better position to police it, right? They're in a better position to monitor the relevant set of activities to ensure I am still, qualified for that credential. And so that's sort of answering both of those questions at once on the surveillance and good identity systems. Paula, do you have any questions you want to answer?
Yeah, I'll add one point on the best examples of identity systems, which is that there's an anti-collusion methodology that some of us might be familiar here, which is called POLIS, and it's a system for basically surfacing what are the areas of consensus that groups which usually disagree with each other have. And this is usually talked about as a very good deliberation methodology and governance methodology. But I think that what we're trying to convey with this paper is that understanding, mapping out different social solidarities and intellectual solidarities, and then understanding what are the connections between them, and fostering connections between highly distant groups is not only a good deliberation technique, but also something that can increase the assurances and the safety of any governance process from an identity verification perspective. So if you know that someone is connected to more diverse groups, then you'll have a higher assurance that this person is not colluding in the system or is not a false replicated identity. So this is something that is not talked about in the context of identity, but I just wanted to share this point, and I'll put on the chat the link to this collusion resistance. You could call it a collusion resistance mechanism.
Thanks, Paula. Mikhail, did you have anything?
Yeah, I'll take the question about questions of Jan about constraining the size of pools. So I would give like explanation about the pools. Actually, with delegation, we gave an incentives to form the pools. So kind of it's a kind of economic incentives like for pool operators to reveal their structure and pull out their accounts into one single node, so that kind of. But we at the same time we never kind of constrained the size of the pools, and we actually wanted to have the opposite. So we wanted to have the largest pools possible, because we did the discounting of the voting power of these accounts that were delegated to the single node operator. So actually, I think that kind of this pool constraint won't help, because the pools itself, they actually try to kind of to split themselves into multiple groups. And as we wrote in the paper, so we figure out that there are some like ties, financial ties between pools, and we can consider this kind of different pools as a single entity, even though it was not like formed on chain, but we've seen it like based on the transaction analysis. So yeah, so the pools kind of, I think that it's a good concept, like that kind of represents some kind of correlations, so we can count this correlation, but it's a kind of challenging topic, because we gave kind of financial incentives to create these pools, but at the same time, if the kind of it's a trade-off between financial incentives and voting power, and if voting power becomes more kind of profitable for pools, then probably they can break out their kind of delegation and just create like solo accounts that actually controlled by the same pool operator.
Perfect. Thanks so much. I guess before we wrap, Pooja, do you have any final words for the group?
Yeah, actually, just based off of what Misha said, I think some people look at this and they say, oh, well, this system didn't work because there were financial incentives and monetary incentives. And I think what the point that Misha just said is really important, which is really when there's something at stake, even if it's voting power over a significant outcome, right? There's going to be incentives to form groups and coordinate to your advantage as a group. And there will be different levels of information asymmetry and accountability there, right, in those groups. But it's not something that just arises because money is at stake. Really, if anything is at stake at a global level of that significance, you will sort of see this kind of coordination. And so, I think the broader project, which I'm part of, is figuring out ways to build sort of systems that are accountable at many levels and push power down at the level, right, at which with subsidiarity and richness, so, right, we don't kind of end up in this like one giant global game that ends in oligopoly. So I think and I see sort of like identity as a really, critical part of that, but really identity in my mind is really a question about how do we, have an accountable set of sort of communication channels and designs around information that don't just very quickly centralize into like a winner-take-all game. And that can be an AI system, it can be a big tech system, it can be a government system. So that's just sort of the larger project and maybe context for everybody. And I thank everybody for reading the paper and their comments. It's been a very fruitful and lovely discussion.
Perfect. And with that, we are going to wrap up today. So thank you again so much for our authors for joining us. Thank you so much, Judith, for all of your amazing comments. And thank you all so much for joining us today. This is the last public research workshop of the academic year. So we will plan to pick things back up again in fall. And in the meantime, if you do have any interesting papers or suggestions or topics that you're interested in, please feel free to send them over to me. We're always open to suggestions. So thank you all again so much. Really appreciate it, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.